I will remind you quickly what is it that we are talking about. So we are in the 17th century. We are focusing on Jesuit works. We are focusing on a number of very, very smart people who traveled from Europe to China and tried to convert the Chinese, make them into Christians. Quite a few of them are very, very famous. One of them is a saint. He didn't travel to China, but he was an inspiration for all Asia missionaries. His name is Francis Xavier. He, together with the Italian visitor Alessandro Valignano, and together with these two Italian fathers, Matteo Ricci and Michele Ruggieri, are the essential names to remember in relationship to the early China mission. We discussed Ricci's situation last week. I'm not sure I emphasized enough what a smart man he was, what a tolerant person he was, what an interesting person he was, and how well he understood what Valignano and other fathers thought it would be necessary to do in the East. That is, the policy of accommodation, of cultural accommodation, matching the Christian message to the cultural realities in Asia, so that Christianity doesn't look like a foreign teaching, like a foreign religion, but like something that could fit nicely into the cultural pattern of East Asia. Now, the several ways that the cultural policy of accommodation involved, the several ways of action, included very, very high on the list the charming of the local hosts by the most outstanding cultural finds and scientific finds of the Europeans. Ricci and many of the fathers that came after him were very good, very well trained in sciences, and they were very able to produce things, to bring initially things and then produce things to impress their hosts. Many of them were very modern objects at that time, like telescopes and clocks and compasses. Maps were also another thing that impressed the hosts very, very significantly. We discussed this particular map last week, so I won't go into it. There are several versions. I won't go back to it. There are several versions of this map, and we discussed it at some length. What we need to remember is that maps are never objects that are innocent. They tell a story. They are meant to project a vision of the world, either something that we know is real or we know it's imaginary, at least at that time. Maps suggest a way of classifying reality, so that's why they tell us so many things about their makers and about the cultures, the context in which they appear. Do remember that this one was a European-made map made by Europeans in China for the use of their Chinese audiences, and therefore they had to match and accommodate the local cultures very, very well, as we already know. We have been through the texts on the map, and we discussed them a bit. We emphasized the fact that the text matches antiquated and very modern knowledge, but we don't have time to go through this once again. These are the copies of the map, a Japanese copy. This tells us how much the maps made by the Jesuits, by Ricci and his colleagues, were able to have an impact on actual Chinese products. This comes from a Chinese encyclopedia of the time. These are the works that Ricci produced, many of them in Chinese. He was able to master very good written Chinese. He also wrote in his native language, in Italian, just as he wrote a number of letters in other languages, European languages as well, like Spanish, for instance. All in all, the most important work, the one that we left for today, was not published during his lifetime. It's his journals. It's his own written notes that were ultimately edited by confrère by a fellow Jesuit and published after his death. We were going to discuss about this today. These are things that he produced together with several Chinese scholars and Christian converts. Romanization system, early Romanization system, a way of transcribing Chinese characters to which his name is, with which his name is associated. These were meant to show you how much Ricci is topical these days. So many of his books get translated from Chinese into European languages or get commented editions in Chinese, and so on and so forth. We can move through this. Here we were wrapping things up in relationship to accommodation. So we discussed the importance of blending Confucian teachings with Christianity, or Christianity with Confucian teachings, in order to implement the Jesuit program of conversion from top to bottom, right? Remember that the Jesuits were interested primarily into turning the upper echelons of society into turning them Christian. These are the names of the so-called three pillars of the Christian church in the early days of the Jesuit mission. They are very, very important people in the history of Christianity in China, as well as in their own right as scholars, scientists, and so on. A few more points on accommodation, enculturation. This program of supplementing Confucianism by Christianity against local popular religions like Taoism and Buddhism. Finally, that's where we stopped. We skipped a few slides, but we will go back to them once again. Now, one of Ricci's very important early continuators is an Italian man by the name of Giulio Alaini. Now, Alaini was a scientist just like Ricci and a geographer. He worked on maps with Ricci and keeping Ricci's geographical conventions alive by producing copies and improving on existing ones. He wrote a great deal of stuff in Chinese, mostly. Now, what I'm very interested in is this text, which is A Life of Jesus, which combines the Christian message with the and the visual conventions of 16th century religious message with a Chinese background. I'm not going to explain to you each and every the meaning of each and every image over here, but they are kind of obvious. This is one of the earliest examples of the ways in which the Christian message was rephrased, how the visual as well as the written dimension of Christian texts were transferred into Chinese, and in the process were changed and adapted. Now, do realize, of course, that all the words in Chinese here were created by the missionaries in order to explain the story of Jesus. So we have here a word about God, for example, right? We have here Jesus's name translated or transcribed into Chinese, and so on and so forth. The linguistic dimension of the Jesuit adventure in China is absolutely fascinating. These people needed to create a new language for what they had to say. And they had to be sure that the way they expressed the Christian message, on the one hand, fully expressed the ideas they wanted to convey, and on the other hand, fit against the cultural background of the Chinese culture. So they had to find the right words. The most complicated problem, of course, had to do with the translation of the name of God into Chinese. This had been an issue in the Japanese mission, and Xavier himself, when he was in Japan, had significant problems because he had used a term that had very strong Buddhist connotations. So for a long while, people who were listening to the Jesuits praying in the street felt that they were just a branch of Buddhists coming over and giving their own version of Buddhism. Other issues that had to do with the translation of the name of God connect with the possibility of using ancient terms like Shangdi from classical Chinese culture in relationship to the Christian God. All these issues are too complicated for us to discuss here and would involve going into too much detail. But once again, the most fascinating thing about these people is that they made themselves into an interface between two very different cultures and experienced in finding ways for expressing what they wanted to say in keeping with the conventions of the local culture. I simply love these images, so I selected just a number of them. You can feel free to read them or enjoy them or take a look at them and see how the very simple story of Jesus here is the story of Jesus is told in very simple words, with a very simple message. Other early Jesuit fathers include, among other things, among others, another Italian father by the name of Sabatino de Ursis, who specialized in scientific texts. I'm not going to tell you more about him, but we have here another example of Jesuit science at work, and a German father who did work on medicine. Now, this is one of the most fascinating texts I found while refurbishing the PPT for this class, putting it anew together. I was not familiar with this work or with these images. They come as illustrations to a book known as An Outline of Western Theories of the Human Body. You will have enough time back at home to look at them in some detail. I'm no specialist in medicine at all. Obviously, it seems to me that there are visual conventions from China appropriated to Western medicine, but I'm not sure about this. I know a bit more about this other work, which Schreck put together with a Chinese scholar. This is known as Illustrations and Explanations of Wonderful Machines, and Schreck used some of the books that related to engineering and science that were quite popular in the West at his time in order to illustrate the text of this book. Now, you may not see this very well over here. Of course, you can have a lot of fun by just taking a look at these sophisticated machines over here, but you are going to see this better here. So this image appears in Schreck's text, and this is the inspiration. This comes from a text by an engineer of the time published a good 50 years earlier, which is about siege machines or whatever. So notice that this is a more or less exact reproduction of the same. This one comes from another book by an Italian engineer. The book was produced at about the same time. Do notice that the imagery is quite similar, with a bit of changes in the human figure, of course, but not that much. Another third source of inspiration for all this is the work of yet another, a more up-to-date work of yet another Italian engineer by the name of Vittorio Zonga. Now, what is interesting about this is that a very famous sinologist and historian of science by the name of Joseph Needham, who edited a hugely impressive and valuable collection known as Science and Technology, I think, or in China. Yeah, I don't remember the exact title, but basically in the volume dedicated to this particular branch of sciences, actually not him because he didn't write it, the person who actually wrote the volume under Needham's editorship made all these comparisons and tracked down all the sources of Schreck's images to European texts. This is how myself was able to come up with these connections. It's a very, very interesting thing, because like this we realize to what degree Western knowledge traveled to China and was changed in the process and made made its impact over there. Now, a very quick explanations about this slide. These two names, unfortunately, I don't have time to discuss about them at length. Both are very important. Early Italian fathers. Ruggieri, in fact, as I told you last week, is often remembered as the very first sinologist. He was the one that opened China. He was the one that was able to gather some footing in China proper. He was able to speak Chinese, get to know Chinese, get to write Chinese. He was the one that trained Ricci and was responsible for a while with the whole Jesuit expansion program. His work is not as impressive today as Ricci's, mostly because of Ricci's journal, but if we are to see things in historical perspective, Ruggieri's contribution is enormous. In point of actual work, we remember him as being an editor of the very first Christian catechism, known as the CH06, that was later superseded by the TW-Shi. Also, by his work on this Portuguese-Chinese dictionary I mentioned last week in association with Ricci. He also put together a manuscript atlas of China. He did, together with Ricci, a draft translation of the 4 books of the Sishu, and part of a translation of the Taxue was also published later. He wrote poetry in Chinese. He wrote many fascinating letters that are a pleasure to read, and they give us a good image of this man's mind when confronted with Chinese culture and Chinese language. He's another Italian man by the name of Niccolò Longobardo wrote several things. He was not quite in favor of Ricci's policies, but one of the things he wrote, and which we remember with a lot of interest, is a letter that was published in several European languages in the early 17th century, known as a short account of the Kingdom of China. It's not really short, it's pretty extensive, and it was a laudatory text giving us a lot of information on China. It made a strong impact on Europe in the first decade of the 17th century. These are the images of the two fathers from a later Jesuit text. This would be Ruggieri, this would be Longobardo. Now, other names, Diego de Pantoja, who wrote and had published in Europe an account of the entry of certain Jesuit fathers into China, which is a less favorable text to the Chinese. It does mention a few things that do not sound very nice, or that contradict the image of everything being perfect in China. The letter was published in various languages, including English, in later times, and it was quite important. Of course, it was superseded by Ricci's journals edited by Trigot, as we will find out pretty soon. A few other names here, two other names here. I would like to point out the name of this man, Michel Baudier, who is not a Jesuit father, but rather a historian, but who shows us how, to what degree the texts such as Mendoza's and Trigot's, we will talk about it in a short while, could influence people who had nothing to do with China directly, firsthand. This is a page from Baudier's text known as Histoire de la Cour du Roi de la Chine, or History of the Court of the King of China. Notice, please, how Escalante's Chinese characters get twisted here. Remember that Escalante had published in 1577 3 very famous Chinese characters, the one for heaven, the one for king, and the one for city, which kept on being reproduced over and over and over again. This is how twisted they came to look in Baudier. We can skip the discussion about Guerrero and Pierre du Jarric to discuss about Trigault. Now, Trigault was a Walloon father, a father from the French-speaking part of today's Belgium, and he was in China at the times of Matteo Ricci. He was entrusted with Ricci's journal after Ricci had died. He was entrusted with it on his trip to Europe. So Trigault made a trip, left China to go to Europe to get resources and support and personnel for the Jesuit China mission. He traveled spectacularly around Europe, and he was impressed people through both the way he spoke and the way he looked. Notice that this is a portrait of Trigault made by Rubens. So several people made portraits of Trigault, and we have here yet another portrait showing him in the costume of a Chinese scholar. Now, as he moved to Europe, he made sure that he would have Ricci's text published in 1615. I will talk about this in just one short while. Before we do this, apart from being an editor and to a large degree a co-writer of Ricci's journal, Trigault's name is associated with this text. This text is known as Aid to the Eyes and Ears of Western Scholars, or you can call it an audiovisual guide to Westerners studying Chinese. It's basically a text offering a romanization of Chinese characters and a significant discussion on Chinese phonology and Chinese vocabulary. It's a really, really important text for the history of phonology, for the history of linguistics, and particularly for phonology, because we can kind of recover the pronunciation of Chinese, of Guanhua, of the Mandarin language of early 17th century by using this and several other texts. So it is a very important text, quite well studied these days. This is, however, the text that everybody knew in his lifetime, the text for which he was famous and the text for which he remains famous until today. This is the Latin text, title of the book. This is how the book was initially published. De Christiana Expedizione apud Sinas, or On the Christian Expedition to China, being or taken from the journals of Matteo Ricci. Now do notice here, for those of you who can read a bit of Latin, that we have the word auctore, or author, and under it we have the name of Trigault. So in some editions of the book, Trigault appeared like the author of this book. His real role as an editor of Ricci's journals is huge. He basically rephrased much of what Ricci had to say, making it more flamboyant. Everything that he writes is flamboyant, is filled with detail, is exaggerated in many senses, and it is this version of Ricci's journals that stayed in Europe, not the original manuscript version, which stayed in an archive, as I told you last week, until the beginning of the 20th century, when it was finally edited and then re-edited, and then re-edited. Okay, so we have 3 different versions. This one is the standard one, produced at mid-20th century by an Italian scholar, and this is the most recent one. This is just a shorter version, published quite recently, but this is available easily on Amazon and other book sources. Okay, so this is what people read. Now the problem is that a lot of scholars today tend to read this, that is, to read the original text of Riches. But the one that had most impact on Europe at the time was this. Okay, so we are going to make reference to this particular text while keeping in mind that for any serious scholarly discussion of the text, we need to discuss both this and this, yeah, and the original Italian text. Now, I will try to move as quickly as I can through this text. It has the same format as Mendoza's. That is, it begins with a general discussion about China, and then it discusses the progress of the Christian mission. This is the general format of many, many texts of the time. So we have a descriptive first part that is of much interest for in general, and then a second part narrating this progress, how Christians made it, how the Jesuits made their way from southern China to the court, and how the mission advanced. This is of more interest for historians of the church and for people interested in these aspects. We will discuss only parts of the first half. Now, this one, the first chapter, is dedicated to the name, location, and the Chinese Empire at large. We have information that we are familiar with. Probably the most important point here is the very strong statement that China is both Serica, Sina from classical times, and Cathay. By that time, a Jesuit father had traveled from India to close to Beijing in order to demonstrate that Cathay is the same as China, and Ricci is very strong when making these statements. He also mentions the name of Zhonghua. He mentions the Great Wall. He does add quite a few extra details that are of no interest to us right now. He takes the trope of richness and availability of stuff in China and develops it. He mentions tea. Then he discusses the mechanical arts of China, of the Chinese, who are a very industrious people. Remember that we know about them, about the Chinese being skillful and good craftsmen ever since the days of Hayton the Armenian, so 200-300 years at least. The same trope appears here. We have a discussion about how good the Chinese are at making books, their interest in dramas and shows, which is a bit too exaggerated for a good Christian father. So the Chinese like too much their plays, just like Westerners do. But joke aside, this is a very important point here. Chinese are different from other peoples that Westerners proceed to turn into Christian, because they are quite like us Westerners. So they are potentially much closer to convert, to be turned into Christian than other peoples over there. This trope of sameness, the fact that the Chinese civilization is culturally on a par with Western culture, is quite emphatically present over here. For example, he says there are many points of advantageous contact between ourselves and the Chinese people because the similarity of customs is rather remarkable. So this makes the Chinese into kind of a favorite partner for projecting Christian truth. And this is a point that missionaries constantly emphasize. This places China above all the other cultures Europe had interacted with or was interacting with at that time. Very interesting chapter on liberal arts, sciences, and use of academic degrees. This is the point where China is said to be, well, not quite run by philosophers, but philosophers like scholars, right? But to be very much influenced by the scholars in its day-to-day administration. And this is where the discussion about Chinese characters, Chinese writing, Chinese language, and particularly Chinese characters develops at quite some length. I will skip quickly through all this. You will have the Chinese slide coming up shortly. There is a quite clear comparison with Egyptian hieroglyphics. The idea that ideographs represent things rather than words. The very word ideograph doesn't appear, but we have it in this English translation over here. We have 70 to 80,000 characters according to Ricci. Chinese is said to be an equivocal language, an ambiguous language. This trope of ambiguity, the fact that Chinese is ambiguous and cannot, it's you don't really get it at first when you first hear something. It's difficult for you to understand. So this idea will appear in a number of texts throughout the century. The vision that writing is independent from is an independent language for the eyes is rephrased very, very strongly. Notice again that Trigault does so much more intensely than Ricci. So if we read Ricci's own journals against what Trigault has to say, the differences are quite significant. We don't have time to do this, of course. No other language is as difficult for a foreigner to learn as Chinese. You would agree, some of the Western students, I suppose, here. Maybe, maybe not, I don't know. Now, we can skip through this. Something that is unique and quite shocking appears closer to the end of this chapter, when basically he says that, okay, the language is ambiguous, it's difficult for us to understand, but it is very effective as a communicational tool. And this is a statement that I love and that has stuck to my mind. This method of writing, mind you, it's not about speech, it's about writing. By drawing symbols instead of forming letters gives rise to a distinct mode of expression by which one is able, not only with a few phrases, but with a few words, to set forth ideas with great clearness, which in our writing would have to be expressed in roundabout circumlocutions and perhaps with far less clarity. To put it otherwise, when they write, they express their ideas more clearly than we can in our Western languages. So Chinese writing is a highly effective tool for communicating thought. This is testifies to Ricci's own admiration for the language he had toiled to study and he could master so well, and is a very important brick at the foot of the image of China, or as part of the image of China, of Chinese writing and Chinese language at large, as a fascinating thing to be studied with admiration by the Europeans. 50 years later, one individual would basically declare Chinese to have been the language spoken before the Tower of Babel. That is the one unique language God gave to humans. We'll get back to this. I'm not sure if we are able to do so today. But basically, please remember this when we get to discuss about John Webb. Chinese philosophy contains many names. Confucius is the most important one, but all Chinese philosophers are at least as significant, at least as important as our own pagan, that is non-Christian philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, and all the others, and even superior to most of them. This idea that basically suggests that China is a land of culture and of philosophy, superior perhaps to teachings or philosophical teachings in Europe will remain important throughout the next century and even longer. This is the text about language in Chinese, so you can go through it, the 2.5 pages. Then we discuss about imperial examinations, imperial exams, and yet another trope that we have seen now gets formulated very, very strongly. This idea goes like this. He says, I will sum things up. Basically, administrators, judges, magistrates, all sorts of people are not professionals, are not trained specifically for that thing, but rather they are selected from among scholars. And why is it that the Chinese feel that any scholar can fulfill any position in government? Because they have superior ethics. Their morality is so high that this beats any professional qualification. It's enough for somebody to be trained into ethics and morality to get a position in government. And that's why they run their empire so well, because they privilege morality and ethics rather than, as we do in Europe, training or whatever. This is very interesting because, again, this emphasizes the idea that Europe is a land of philosophers and of high moral standards. We can continue, then we have several other titles dedicated to, chapters dedicated to government, Chinese customs like politeness, food, funeral rituals, dress, various rites. He goes back to religion, and here he emphasizes the idea that the Chinese are ripe for conversion, and they've been waiting for this opportunity, for our coming, to give them the truth of revelation, and then they will embrace Christianity very, very eagerly. This vision is something that the Jesuits will keep on repeating for the next 100 and something years, over and over again. Just give us a bit more time, a bit more time, a bit more time, and we'll make it. Why? Because their own culture prepares them for the Christian message. Now, this is emphasized throughout the book in striking passages like this one. Of all the pagan sects known to Europe, I know of no people who fell into fewer errors in the early ages of their antiquity than did the Chinese. So their own culture equips them for the Christian message. They even recognized and worshipped one supreme being, whom they called the King of Heaven, the Tianzhu, that would be the term here, right? So basically the Chinese are monotheists, and they are very, very well prepared for what we have to say. The same ideas are over and over again repeated. Notice that he even insists that they have no idols. They do, however, believe in one deity who preserves and governs all things on earth. And again, all we have to do is make sure that the Chinese remember. Because Ricci contrasts the ancient situation when things used to be like this. So they used to have one single God, and they used to have something very close to monotheistic understanding of religion. However, in the meantime, Buddhism, Taoism, and also, Neo-Confucianists in Song Dynasty times have twisted Confucian thought, and our duty is to make the Chinese remember. We have already seen this idea. We've seen it. It's not new. It's an act of memory. We need to we need to teach the Chinese how to read their texts again. Their texts themselves contain the truth, our truth, the Christian truth, the only truth from the Jesuits' perspective, from the missionaries' perspective. So conversion is an act of remembering. Conversion is an act of memory. So the philosophy, they will understand why we are right, not only because reason will tell them, we will show them and they will get it, but also because their own ancient philosophers tell them the same things. This idea of a recuperation of ancient knowledge is something that is striking and particularly interesting, and this would become like the major characteristic of the Jesuit program in China, not shared by other Christian orders. So Franciscans, Dominicans, other missionaries, when they went to China, they disagreed with this, and ultimately this led to a lot of trouble and to a lot of problems in Europe. We'll discuss about this next time. This text produced by Trigot on the basis of Ricci's journals was translated into French, Italian, Spanish, English ultimately, partially, many languages, was edited throughout the first half of the century many times, or several times, and it was the most influential text about the European image of China for a good part of the century. I would call it the second major China master text. The first would be Mendoza's, 1585. The second is this, 1615. The third is this. This was produced by a Portuguese father known as Álvaro Semedo. It was it was published in 1642 under the title of Imperio de la China, translated into English in 1655. Now, it's got many things of interest to us. These are the passages related to language. I don't have time to go through them at some length. What is of most interest is the fact that for him, the language is not difficult. It is more easy to be learned than Latin. So, students here, you can take some solace in this. Imagine yourselves doing some Latin instead of some Chinese, at least according to Semedo. Also, he finds it sweet, a very delightful language to hear. He is one of the very first people to mention the spoken aspects of the language. He does, again, he mentions the same thing. Then he talks about the lexical variety of the language. He says that in English, well, not in English, this is the English translation, we use one single word like take, and look at how many words they use in Chinese in order to refer to the same concept. Well, in English you would probably have a number of words that would translate better than take here, but the point is that the richness of Chinese is exciting rather than complicated, annoying, and difficult. The usual myth of universality, an ancient language, the first typology of Chinese letters in a European language, their history, and also the way of writing or calligraphy. He talks about Xingshu, also about the Caoshu, and two other ways of writing. And here he does the first European account I know of discussing how Chinese characters are composed by strokes and what happens when we add strokes. And finally, the very first discussion I know of Pushou, of radicals. So he talks about the fact that, for instance, every letter which signifies any tree must have joined with it the letter which signifies wood. And the same goes for metal and so on and so forth. Linguistically, this is a very important text. So it opens up the scientific discussion of Chinese language and Chinese writing. It is based on a popular understanding of, on the common understanding of Chinese at the time, but it is still fascinating and of long impact. So these ideas, or these discussion will appear in many later texts. Exactly this. How from 1 you obtain 10, and how from 10 you obtain earth, and how from earth you obtain king, and so on and so forth. And from there jade, right? How by adding strokes you obtain new characters. He also makes a discussion about how characters are composed. So if you take a sun and the moon and you put them together, you obtain Ming, or obtain brilliance, right? Or brightness, as he calls it. Then you take a door and you take a heart and you obtain sadness, affliction. You obtain Men, the Men character. This would appear several times in later texts. This is of much more importance than we realize, because this is new information and it will be recycled and used and put to use in many, many texts in later times. Now, Semedu appeared, as far as I know, in the original version, had no had just these two illustrations. The photograph, or sorry, not the photograph, the drawing of his portrait, okay, and then this image of Chinese costume, right? Now, in the English version, we have this. We have a map of China. Now, this map is interesting because, well, for a number of reasons. Number one, north is at the top. Number two, we have three different, well, kind of images of people. Let's take a closer look. We have a king of China, a China man, and a China woman, right? Decorations to the map, or next to the map. Now, let's see exactly how this map came about. This is just for fun. I will move a bit more quickly. Now, people basically say that this, at the very origin of this, is this. This is a very famous map which appeared for the first time in the early 17th century in an atlas produced by two Dutch cartographers, Hondius and Mercator. Now, notice that here, north is here. Okay, this is north. West is at the top. Later, the same, turn this upside the other way around. Right? So now we have north at the top, and it's more or less the same map with extra decorations. Now I'm going to go on a tangent here because I loved these particular two things. This one has, of course, to do with the Japanese Christianity, the fate of Japanese Christianity. At the time, there was a lot of persecution against Christians in Japan. So we have a lot of martyrs dying, and the death of Christians in Japan impressed Europeans very much. So this is easy to understand. This is what? You may remember, this is another version, even better, more colorful one. You may remember from Mendoza that he talked about Chinese land ships, about the fact that in China they use kind of wagons, wind wagons, and they put sails, and then they try to, they are very, very effective on various areas of China. Now, when updating the PPT for today, I explored several maps, and I noticed that this particular image somehow seemed to obsess people to a large degree. So on a small tangent, notice it on a map from 1675. So it's there again. This is a special design of the same, produced by a man whose name is important for us, John Wilkins, in which he tries to appropriate the same concept. And earlier, we have it as early as 1600 in the Netherlands, when they tried to create similar objects, and apparently they even did. Now, in the Netherlands, we have strong winds, so maybe they worked quite smoothly. Now, apart from this, at about 1637, we have several painters, Dutch painters, obsessing over the same thing and representing the same land ship over and over and over again. So a little thing like that came to be of much importance. Back to our discussion of the maps. You can explore such topics by yourselves. This is just for fun, huh? So you don't need to remember anything if you don't want to. It's just for the fun of it. Little details like this that tell us very, very important stories. There is scholarly literature on the quite some significant scholarly literature, not least because the poet, the English poet John Milton, also writes about, well, land ships, and he doesn't quite agree with Mendoza. He doesn't believe him. Now, 1626, on the basis of the earlier map, we have this, a map by John Speed, known as the Kingdom of China, an English map. It follows, notice that it's got the same design, and it's got its own images of people on the right and on the left, a Chinean woman, a Chinean man, a Chinean man, and a Chinean man, and the land ship. This is at the top. What else? It's over here. What else would you expect? The cross in Japan. And finally, and that's where we want to go, this man and his story. Samuel Purchas was a continuator of Richard Hakluyt's project of editing travel texts. You remember, you may or may not remember from last week, but Richard Hakluyt put together a fascinating, long, large collection of voyages, of travel narratives into the English language of much, much impact. His continuator was Purchas, who produced throughout his life a number of texts, and as he was approaching, well, not far from the moment he died, he put out his own travel collections known as Hakluytus Posthumus, or Purchas's Pilgrims, which is a very authoritative collection of travel texts interspersed with his own comments. Among other things, he includes a map of China. Notice that it's the map of China we saw first, the Hondius map, Hondius Mercator map of the early 17th century. Later on, he starts to comment on it and basically say that the map, this map, is wrong. It's, everybody uses it and everybody uses this or similar maps, but they are all wrong. And they are all wrong, and let me tell you why they are all wrong. Because look, somebody found a real map of China from a Chinese person somewhere in Southeast Asia. That somebody brought it to Europe, and Master Hakluyt, Richard Hakluyt, the person whose book he continues, acquired it, and now it's in my hands. It's in my possession. And now I'm going to give you the real image of China. So don't believe people like Ortelius, Mercator, or Hondius, who give us nothing less than China in their China. To put it otherwise, they create their own fantastic vision of China. So all the maps we have seen, all the maps everybody has used are plain wrong. The real map, I'm going to show it to you. The map, he says, included Chinese characters in the original. Unfortunately, I couldn't read them all, but what I did is that I compared this original Chinese map I'm going to offer you with whatever other information I have, and removed the Chinese characters and replaced them with Western characters. And this is the map, ladies and gentlemen. He said, after all these many, details. Notice that basically this map stands out, is very close to Semedus, the one from which we started. So it's got the three images, of people. Instead of having a Chinese king, we have Matteo Ricci here. But so we have Ricci here. But most importantly, we notice that it's got a Chinese title. That's the only thing written in Chinese characters that was preserved from the Chinese original. And this is a map that we cannot trace. We don't have it. It doesn't exist in an original Chinese version. The characters were written probably by a missionary hand rather than a Chinese person. But all in all, this is the origin of Semedu's map, and the whole reason why I'm telling you this story is to show you how accident could influence history and historical representation to a very large degree. The fact that Richard Hakluyt acquired a map and that map reached Samuel Purchas, which he published against common cartographers of the time, ultimately tells us why in the English edition of Semedu we have a map which we couldn't have in the previous 1642 editions. So all these stories tell us what? They tell us, apart from the fact that accident is very important, they tell us a story about dissemination of knowledge. We have one book that appears in Italian. We would be wise to look at all versions we can read or we can find of the same book in other European languages. Because once knowledge appears in one language, it changes in the process of transmission. It acquires nuance, it becomes different. Some points get emphasized, some points disappear. New drawings, new images appear, disappear. Everything changes. Ultimately, we have larger image that stays more or less the same. But anything that is large is made up of smaller aspects, okay? Smaller points, all of which are of interest, all of which can tell us stories. This is the little story of this map of the comprehensive view of the unified lands of the Ming dynasty. This was, by the way, so beloved by other cartographers that it was also stolen by the debris printers. We talked about them last time, and produced, included in their travel, very lavishly produced travel accounts. It looks like this. So we have an illustrated version of the same map as well. Later, Jesuit fathers. We are in the 1650s, and we begin by names and dates. 1654, 1655, 1658, three texts associated with an Italian father, very, very important father, by the name of Martino Martini. He wrote quite a few things. This is very important, and we will discuss about it when the time comes, probably next week. It's an early text dedicated to the history of China. It's the most comprehensive history of China produced in a European language. We have it in Latin, but it was translated as well into French, I think, if my memory serves me right. And it begins with Chinese history from the times of the legendary Emperor Fuxi all the way to the times of Jesus Christ, to Han times. He produced only the first in a series of, he wanted to continue it, but he didn't. But it was enormously important for a number of reasons I'll mention later, not now. He also produced a text on the Qing conquest of the Ming, which was of some impact at the time. Europeans were finding out about the change of regime in China later than 1644, of course, and then the times of trouble. And also this new Chinese atlas, which was the first wide, large-scale, detailed atlas, that is a series of maps rather than one single map, produced in Europe about China. So the very first Western Atlas of China. The second name to be remembered here is that of a Polish sinologist by the name of Michael Boym. He wrote several texts, including one on the Chinese flora sinensis. We'll talk about it a bit later. The last name on the list is that of a Jesuit historian. He wrote a history of the Jesuit mission synthesizing earlier texts. His name is Daniele Bartoli. Very, very important, very, very interesting, but we won't be talking about it because we cannot. Now, Martini wrote several other things of importance. The exciting one is known, or the most interesting one for us is this, which is the earliest grammar of the Chinese language actually ever published in Europe. It did appear, not in his lifetime, after he died, in just a few copies as an supplement to a collection of travels published in 1696. You can find it online and take a look at it in Latin. It's been translated and it's been re-edited, and Martini's work in general has attracted quite a lot of sinological attention in recent times. Now, these are the images, the cover and the two covers of his text on the war between the Qing troops and the Ming soldiers. They suggest violence that is not really present in the text. And this is the atlas. Now, the atlas is itself included as part of a larger publication by one very famous cartographer, Dutch cartographer by the name of Blauw. Blauw produced a many-volume, multi-volume atlas. Volume 10 is dedicated to Asia. The very first map is this. It's got nothing to do with Martini. It's just a very beautiful map of China, map of Asia. And it's got a few illustrations about the Chinese over here. And this part of Blauw's atlas is or was produced by Martini. It's known as exactly like this, the New Atlas of China. It begins with a beautiful map of the whole empire, and then we have maps of various Chinese provinces. This one is for a northern province that doesn't exist in China anymore, the Peizhili province. Then we have one of Jiangxi, and so on and so forth. So we have, I don't remember exactly how many, 15 or more maps. Each of them contain little decorative elements like this. I have selected them all and put them here because they represent a quite powerful early articulation of the ways in which China and Chinese people will be represented visually in European arts in the 17th and mostly the 18th century. This way of creating the Chinese people visually is known as Shinwaseri. And we will talk about it at some length. There are certain visual conventions that are particularly clear and that we can see at work already here. We can see the Chinese person fascinated by science. This topic will appear over and over again, this visual thing. Notice the intricate detail of ornamentation present here. Notice the presence of the wise missionary joined by the wise Chinese scholar. Notice also the way the certain positions that Chinese, the ways in which people stand and are shown to be. The Chinese ladies, delicate and remote and away somehow from reality proper, and so on and so forth. I don't have time right now to analyze with you each and every one of them, but you can easily see these things as announcing the visual language of the next century. Now, Towards the end of the atlas, we also have a text written by a Dutch philologist, which includes a great deal of Chinese text about the various information related to the calendar that is of much interest. You can find the French version of the atlas, by the way, at the National Library. So if you want to go to the National Library and make an application, you can read it. Other images from a different digital source, all of them testifying to this visual language of representing China and the Chinese that is on its way of getting fully articulated. This is a later map, and we can stop here. We can stop with Mikhail Boym.